I am 100 years old, and I will begin with the truth that most people only discover when it is almost too late. The body is constantly listening to what you feed it. Every meal is a message. Every plate is either a small act of healing or a quiet step toward disease. When I was younger, no one explained this to me clearly. Doctors treated symptoms, medications controlled numbers, but very few people spoke about the deeper power sitting quietly on the dinner table. I learned that lesson the hard way. In my 50s, I began to collect the same diagnoses that follow millions of people today. My blood pressure climbed higher each year. My cholesterol numbers crept into dangerous territory. My doctor warned me about the early signs of heart disease. Later came the unstable blood sugar, the fatigue after meals, and the feeling that my body was slowly working against me. At the time, I believed what most people believe, that aging automatically brings disease, that the body simply wears out, that pills and procedures are the only tools left once chronic illness appears. But over time, I discovered something that changed the direction of my life. The body has an extraordinary capacity to repair itself when we remove the daily injuries we unknowingly cause. And one of the greatest sources of those injuries is food, not just overeating, not just sugar, the entire dietary pattern. When I began studying nutrition seriously and changed the structure of my meals toward a plant-based way of eating, vegetables, fruits, beans, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, quietly, my health markers began to move in the opposite direction. Numbers improved, energy returned, and for the first time I began to understand that food was not merely fuel, it was information. And that information had the power to influence the course of chronic disease. What I am about to tell you may sound simple, but simplicity is often where the deepest truths hide. Chronic disease does not appear overnight. It develops slowly, quietly, through thousands of small biological reactions happening inside the body every single day. The foods we eat are among the most powerful forces influencing those reactions. For most of my early life, I ate the way many people still eat today. Meat appeared at the center of nearly every meal. Dairy was considered essential. Eggs were praised as perfect nutrition. Vegetables were present, but often as decoration rather than the foundation of the plate. And processed foods, foods stripped of their natural fiber and nutrients, became increasingly common. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The body has remarkable resilience, and it can tolerate poor habits for years. But eventually, the consequences begin to surface. Blood vessels slowly lose their flexibility. Inflammation quietly spreads through tissues. Cholesterol particles accumulate in artery walls. Blood sugar regulation becomes unstable. The immune system becomes confused and overactive. These processes are the foundation of many chronic diseases: heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, and certain inflammatory conditions. What surprised me most when I began studying the science of nutrition was how strongly diet influences these processes. A plant-based diet changes several fundamental biological mechanisms. First, it dramatically increases fiber intake. Fiber is something animal foods contain almost none of, yet the human digestive system depends heavily on it. Fiber feeds the beneficial bacteria living in the gut, and these microorganisms produce compounds that regulate inflammation improve metabolism, and strengthen the immune system. When the gut microbiome is healthy, many systems in the body begin to function more efficiently. Second, plant-based diets are naturally lower in saturated fat. Excess saturated fat can contribute to the buildup of cholesterol within arteries. Over time, these deposits can narrow blood vessels and increase the risk of heart attacks and strokes. When saturated fat intake decreases and plant foods become the primary source of calories, cholesterol levels often begin to fall. Third, plant foods are rich in antioxidants and phytochemicals. These compounds help neutralize oxidative stress, one of the major drivers of aging and disease. Oxidative stress damages cells and tissues over time, but antioxidant-rich foods help protect the body from that damage. Fourth, plant-based diets improve insulin sensitivity. When cells respond better to insulin, blood sugar levels stabilize more easily. This is particularly important for people with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. These mechanisms are not theoretical. They have been studied extensively by researchers. One of the most well-known examples comes from the work of Dr. Dean Ornish. In clinical studies, patients with coronary heart disease adopted a comprehensive lifestyle program centered on a low-fat plant-based diet. Over time, imaging tests showed something remarkable. Plaque inside the arteries actually began to shrink in many participants. Blood flow improved, symptoms decreased. Another physician, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, conducted long-term research with patients who had severe heart disease. Many of these individuals had already undergone bypass surgeries or stent procedures and continued to experience worsening symptoms. When they adopted a strict whole food plant-based diet, a large number experienced dramatic improvements. Angina symptoms often disappeared, and disease progression frequently stopped. These results challenged a long-standing belief that heart disease could only worsen with time. Instead, they suggested that under the right conditions, the body can begin repairing damage. Type 2 diabetes offers another powerful example. Unlike type 1 diabetes, which involves autoimmune destruction of insulin-producing cells, type 2 diabetes is strongly linked to metabolic dysfunction. Excess fat accumulation in muscle and liver cells interferes with insulin signaling. When diet shifts toward whole plant foods, especially foods high in fiber and low in saturated fat, cells often regain sensitivity to insulin. Blood sugar levels begin to normalize. In many cases, patients are able to reduce or eliminate certain medications under medical supervision. Even high blood pressure, one of the most common chronic conditions worldwide, often responds dramatically to dietary change. Plant foods naturally contain potassium, magnesium, and other minerals that help regulate vascular function. When these foods replace highly processed, sodium-heavy diets, blood pressure frequently declines. Now, it is important to be honest about something. The word reverse can sometimes create unrealistic expectations. Not every chronic disease disappears completely. Some damage, especially when present for decades, cannot always be fully undone. Scar tissue in organs may remain. Structural changes in blood vessels may persist. But what can change, sometimes dramatically, is the trajectory of the disease. Progression can slow, symptoms can improve, risk factors can decline, and in certain conditions, measurable biological repair can occur. When I first adopted a plant-based diet, I did not expect miracles. I simply hoped to feel a little better. But what happened over the following years reshaped how I understood health. My blood pressure gradually normalized. My cholesterol dropped to levels my doctor once thought impossible without medication. My energy stabilized throughout the day. The heavy fatigue I once felt after meals disappeared. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For the first time, I felt that my health was not entirely controlled by genetics, aging, or fate. My daily choices mattered. Every meal became an opportunity to support my body rather than burden it. I also discovered that a plant-based diet is not about restriction in the way many people imagine. It is not about starving or eating bland food. In reality, the diversity of plant foods is enormous. Beans, lentils, grains, vegetables of every color, fruits of every flavor, nuts, seeds, each contributes unique nutrients that the body can use. Over time, I learned to build meals around abundance rather than deprivation. A bowl of lentils and vegetables, whole grains paired with fresh greens, fruit and nuts for natural sweetness and nourishment. These foods began to replace the heavy, processed meals that once dominated my diet. And slowly, year after year, my body responded. The aches decreased. The energy remained steady. The laboratory numbers continued to reflect improvement. Looking back now, at the age of 100, I do not believe that diet alone explains every aspect of health. Movement, sleep, stress, relationships, all of these matter. But food remains the most constant influence we place inside the body every single day. 3 times a day, sometimes more, we give ourselves instructions. And when those instructions come from whole plant foods, the body often responds in ways that many people once believed were impossible. When people hear the phrase plant-based diet, many imagine something extreme or complicated. They picture strict rules, unfamiliar foods, or a life of constant restriction. I once believed the same thing, but after living with this way of eating for decades, I discovered something very different. A plant-based diet is not about deprivation. It is about returning to a pattern of eating that the human body understands. The human body evolved for millions of years in an environment where food came directly from the earth. Plants were abundant. Fruits, roots, grains, seeds, and legumes formed the foundation of nourishment for most populations. These foods carried fiber, vitamins, minerals, and thousands of protective compounds that worked quietly inside the body. But as the modern food environment changed, the balance shifted. Processed foods began to replace natural ones. Highly refined oils, sugars, and animal fats became more common. Fiber disappeared from many meals. The body was suddenly flooded with energy-dense foods but deprived of many protective nutrients. Over time, this imbalance created the conditions where chronic disease thrives. What I learned through experience and through the research of physicians who studied nutrition deeply is that when we return to whole plant foods, many of the systems inside the body begin to stabilize again. One of the first systems to respond is the cardiovascular system. Blood vessels are lined with a delicate layer of cells called the endothelium. These cells regulate blood flow, control inflammation, and maintain the flexibility of arteries. Diets high in saturated fat and processed foods can damage this lining over time, making arteries stiff and narrow. Plant foods, however, contain compounds that support endothelial health. Nitrates found in leafy greens can help blood vessels relax. Antioxidants protect cells from oxidative damage. Fiber helps remove excess cholesterol from the bloodstream. Together, these effects create an environment where arteries function more efficiently. This is one reason why plant-based diets are strongly associated with lower rates of heart disease. But the benefits extend beyond the heart. The digestive system also undergoes remarkable changes when plant foods dominate the diet. Fiber becomes the key player here. Unlike animal foods, which contain virtually no fiber, plants provide the structural material that beneficial gut bacteria rely on for survival. Inside the human intestine lives a vast microbial community, trillions of microorganisms forming what scientists call the gut microbiome. These microbes influence far more than digestion. They regulate immune function, metabolic health, inflammation levels, and even aspects of mental well-being. When the diet is rich in diverse plant foods, these microbes produce short-chain fatty acids and other beneficial compounds that nourish the intestinal lining and communicate with the immune system. In contrast, diets low in fiber can reduce microbial diversity and allow harmful bacteria to dominate. In simple terms, the food we eat determines which microscopic allies thrive inside us. Another powerful effect of plant-based nutrition involves energy metabolism. Chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes are deeply connected to how the body handles glucose. When cells become resistant to insulin, sugar remains in the bloodstream rather than entering cells for energy. Over time, this damages blood vessels, nerves, and organs. Whole plant foods tend to stabilize this system in several ways. Their natural fiber slows digestion, preventing sudden spikes in blood sugar. Their lower saturated fat content helps improve insulin sensitivity. Their micronutrients support metabolic pathways that regulate energy production. This is why many individuals who transition to a whole food plant-based diet begin to see improvements in blood sugar control. In some cases, under proper medical supervision, medications can even be reduced. But perhaps one of the most overlooked benefits of plant-based eating is its impact on inflammation. Inflammation is a natural defense mechanism. When the body detects injury or infection, the immune system responds with inflammation to protect tissues. However, modern lifestyles often create a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation that persists for years. This silent inflammation contributes to many diseases: heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, and even certain cancers. Plant foods are naturally rich in anti-inflammatory compounds. Polyphenols, carotenoids, flavonoids, and other phytochemicals work together to calm excessive immune activity and reduce oxidative stress. When the diet consistently provides these protective compounds, the body's internal environment begins to shift away from inflammation and toward balance. Now, let me speak honestly about the practical side of this lifestyle, because theory means very little without real-life application. People often ask me, "What exactly do you eat in a typical day?" My meals are surprisingly simple. Breakfast might be a bowl of oats with fruit, nuts, and seeds. Oats provide soluble fiber that helps regulate cholesterol levels. Fruits bring natural sweetness and antioxidants. Nuts and seeds contribute healthy fats and minerals. Lunch often centers around legumes, beans or lentils, paired with vegetables and whole grains. Beans are nutritional powerhouses. They provide protein, fiber, iron, and slow-burning carbohydrates that keep energy steady. Dinner may include a large variety of vegetables, perhaps steamed greens, roasted roots, or a vegetable stew with herbs and spices. Whole grains such as brown rice, barley, or quinoa add substance and nourishment. Throughout the day, fruits provide snacks that satisfy hunger without overwhelming the body with processed sugars. This way of eating gradually became effortless for me because it aligns with the body's natural needs. Another important lesson I learned over time is that consistency matters more than perfection. No single meal determines your health. It is the overall pattern that shapes the body's condition. When plant foods dominate the plate most of the time, the cumulative effect becomes powerful. Each meal adds fiber. Each meal delivers antioxidants. Each meal reduces exposure to harmful excess fats and processed ingredients. The body responds not to isolated moments, but to patterns repeated over years. Looking back across my life, I realized something profound. Chronic disease rarely appears suddenly. It develops through long-term habits, but the same principle works in reverse. Healing also develops through long-term habits. Each nourishing meal becomes a small act of repair. Each day of supportive nutrition gives the body another opportunity to stabilize blood sugar, reduce inflammation, improve circulation, and restore balance. When these small actions accumulate over months and years, the results can be extraordinary. And this is why I believe that food, when chosen wisely and consistently, can influence the course of many chronic diseases in ways that once seemed impossible. At 100 years old, the most important lesson I can share is this: the human body is not as fragile as we often believe. It is remarkably adaptive, constantly trying to maintain balance, constantly attempting to repair itself. But it can only work with the materials we provide. For many years, I unknowingly gave my body the wrong instructions. My meals were rich in calories, but poor in the nutrients that truly support long-term health. Slowly, the consequences appeared in the form of rising blood pressure, unstable metabolism, and early signs of chronic disease. I assumed that was simply the price of aging. I was wrong. When I changed the structure of my diet and allowed whole plant foods to become the foundation of my meals, something important shifted. The body began responding in ways I had never expected. Inflammation decreased. Energy stabilized. Medical indicators that once worried my doctors began to move in the opposite direction. That experience taught me something powerful. Food is not just fuel for the day. It is information that influences the body's biology. A plant-based diet, centered on vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, provides the nutrients, fiber, and protective compounds that support the body's natural repair systems. In many cases, these changes can slow, improve, and sometimes even reverse aspects of chronic disease. But the true value of this way of eating goes beyond laboratory numbers. It restores a sense of control. It reminds us that health is not determined by a single moment, but by the daily choices we repeat over years. Every meal becomes a decision either to burden the body or to support it. And if my century of life has taught me anything, it is this: When we choose foods that nourish the body consistently, the body often responds with a level of resilience that can surprise even modern medicine.